I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking today on the traditional, ancestral and unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. Thank you very much for attending this event. We've got two fantastic speakers with a lot of diversity in their experience and a lot of depth in their experience. But I think it's always just wonderful to meet with colleagues and to share these experiences of grant writing, because this is not what you are taught in a statistics degree. This is a soft skill, I think, that we have to pick up as we go. So we've got two fantastic speakers this morning, and then hopefully some time for questions. Please pop them in the chat and I'll keep an eye on them, and hopefully we'll have time for a good discussion. So we'll be hearing today from Sabine and Fergal, and Sabine will be speaking first. So I'll introduce Sabine and then we'll get cracking. I'm an early career statistician myself. I've got my notepad ready. So let's go. So Sabine is a biostatistician with a wealth of experience in clinical trials, over 15 years experience working as a statistician in the pharmaceutical industry, where she's contributed to design, analysis and reporting of trials ranging from early clinical phase to post-marketing. She began her academic journey in 2015 and has got a real depth of experience in both the NHMRC and MRFF schemes. She's an accredited statistician in the Society and the Vice Chair of the Executive Committee of the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance Statistics in Trials Interest Group, ACTA Sting. And I encourage you to check out ACTA Sting and what they're up to. I've been really impressed by the wealth of resources over there. So thanks, Sabine, for that. Sabine will be talking primarily about her experience on collaborative grants. So over to you, Sabine. Can't wait.
Yeah, thanks, Tara, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining during your lunchtime session. And for those who have shared their experiences on either collaborative or investigator grants, and I see some familiar faces here, so probably you have more tips to share at the end of the presentation. So I really look forward to that. I'll start sharing the screen and then we can start the first part of the webinar. So Taya, could you maybe confirm if you can see the screen?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And thank you for the Biostatistics and Bioinformatics section for inviting me. As Taya already said, I'm Sabine Braat. I'm a biostatistician at the University of Melbourne. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. And I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So I will be presenting on working as a statistician on collaborative grant applications, and then after this, Fergal will be presenting on investigator grant development for your own grant application. And so I hope to provide you some experience that I had with writing on collaborative grants, and hope it might be helpful for your career. Maybe a little bit of background about myself. I work at MISH, and MISH stands for Methods and Implementation Support for Clinical and Health Research Hub. And we consist of several nodes which are displayed on the screen. So there's a biostatistics and clinical epidemiology node, a health economics node, a co-design and implementation node, a clinical trials node, and a health informatics node. We are a group of academics, and we provide collaborative research support during grant applications, but obviously also during analysis stages of projects. Together with Karen Lamb, who some of you may know, I co-lead a group of about 10 biostatisticians and epidemiologists, and my role is mainly to collaborate with researchers at the University of Melbourne or at the hospitals that are affiliated with the University of Melbourne, especially in the medical field, and it's a range of medical fields going from physiotherapy to cancer to anesthesia, and it can involve all sorts of interventions from an actual drug to an app on your phone or speech therapy. So what are collaborative grants? So collaborative grants is a piece of collaborative work by a team of researchers that are each part of their own research team, and that work together in order to be able to execute that research project. And it can involve collaborations within your academic institution, or it can involve working together with people in other countries, or maybe people from government or from industry. And I probably don't have to convince this audience, but statistics or statisticians play an important role in collaborative grants. Usually they are involved in the design and the conduct, analysis, and interpretation of the study findings. And that can be taking part as part of basic science, of clinical science, or public health research. And some examples of collaborative research or collaborative grants can involve randomized trials or observational studies. So that is a field that I'm mostly involved in. You could also be involved in bridging basic science to actual research in humans, or maybe translating or implementing evidence into clinical practice. And for those bioinformaticians in the audience, you are probably also very familiar with working on collaborative grants. For instance, I'm involved in clinical trials where, as part of that, there are stool samples that are being collected, and the stool samples have to undergo microbiome analysis, which usually involves a bioinformatician outlining a very specific pipeline for bioinformatics analysis. And in that case, the bioinformatician would be part of a collaborative team as part of the design, as well as the analysis specification for that part of the grant application. So my experience with collaborative grants is across so-called Category 1 and non-Category 1 grant applications. So Category 1 grant applications are the ones that are involved coming from major national funding bodies. For example, in Australia, it would be the National Health and Medical Research Council, or NHMRC, or the Medical Research Future Fund, MRFF. But if you go abroad, then in the United States, you can think about the National Institute of Health, and in the United Kingdom, about the Medical Research Council. Then there are also non-Category 1 funding bodies. They usually have less funds available. But if you look at the list that is displayed on the screen, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation might actually be an exception to the rule. They fund a lot of research in low and middle income countries. And sometimes the funds that they have available to fund research are even more than the Australian government might be able to offer for the same clinical trial. But other examples of non-Category 1 grant applications could consist of colleges, such as the Australian and New Zealand College of Anesthesiologists. Maybe within your own institute, you can have seed funding that is mostly tailored towards early career researchers, or you can have health institutes that have research funding, or maybe philanthropic institutes. So we also sometimes contribute to those grant applications in a collaborative way. As part of a reviewer, I've been sitting on grant panels for the Health Research Council of New Zealand. And as in my role that I currently have, I've contributed to many grant applications. And at the moment, the ones I've been successful on some, and I hold either a chief investigator or an associate investigator position on about 20 Category 1 grants across NHMRC and MRFF. Now, I will mostly focus on NHMRC and MRFF applications in the remainder of this presentation. So what are the typical components of a collaborative grant? Well, they're probably not that very different from the components from an investigator-initiated grant. You have the science, which is captured in the grant or the research proposal, and that is probably where most of your energy and time will be going towards when you're part of a collaborative grant, and that's where the most interesting part of the work will happen. But obviously, in order to show that the grant can be executed, you need to show that you have a team of investigators that is able to execute the grant. So as part of that, you will probably have to write a resume for yourself, where that consists of a 1-page or a 2-page profile, and list your top 5 or your top 10 publications. And obviously, this is an application to receive funding to be able to execute your project proposal. So that means there is a budget proposal as part of the grant, and as part of that budget proposal, there is also a statistical budget involved. And all of this goes administratively to a system. For example, in Australia, it would be the system Sapphire. Again, you would have a profile within that system that has to be set up, and as a collaborator, you would have to accept that you are happy to be part of a collaborative grant applications within the system. So the role of a statistician in a collaborative grant is obviously to get the statistical sections of the collaborative grant correct. And they are very important and critical to the success of a collaborative grant application. Think, for example, about the NHMRC clinical trials and cohort study grant applications. They have a success rate of sometimes as low as 5%. So your section contributes to the markings of that grant application and have to be near perfect. Obviously, what people think when they think about statisticians working as part of a collaborative grant is that you are the one mostly involved in the sample size calculation and statistical analysis section, which will involve thinking about what formula you will have to apply to come up with your sample size or what model you will have to fit in order to analyze the data. But it is not only your role as a statistician to write those sections in regards to sample size and statistical analysis. It's also important for you to look through the entire grant to see if all statistical aspects of the grant flow from start to finish. And it starts with defining your research question, to defining your hypothesis, to defining the study design that is appropriate for the hypothesis, and the actual analysis methods that then estimate what you actually want to show in terms of your hypothesis testing or your research question. So as a statistician, your role is more than just a sample size calculation and a sample size statistical analysis section. It's about the entirety of the grant, whether the statistical aspects of the entire grant are covered. And that consists of obviously a research question, the design of the study, the sample size. In clinical trials, it involves randomization and a statistical method section. Those are the components that I typically focus on when I review a grant application for NHMRC and MRFF. But when you look at other funding bodies, such as NIH or MRC, then you might have to deliver more than just those sections in the research proposal. There may be a need for a data management plan, a statistical analysis plan, and even a data and safety monitoring plan as part of the application. So a lot of more time will go into writing those parts of information, supplementary information, on top of the science that already is contributed to the actual research proposal. I will not go too much in depth about the actual research proposal, because obviously that will depend on the actual project that is being applied for. But I would like to stress the importance of getting the research question right as part of a collaborative grant. The research question is the part that informs the study design, that informs the sample size, and that informs the statistical methods. And it is an interaction with your collaborator, how to refine and how to define that research question to the level that you need as a statistician for informing the sample size or for informing the statistical analysis. Usually when a collaborator comes to me with a request to support a collaborative grant, one of the first questions you get asked is, what sample size do I need? But those discussions obviously require you to understand the research question. So very often, the first topic we will be discussing is what is the research question and what will be the study design that is able to answer that research question before I'm going to be able to answer the question about sample size calculation. That is your role as a statistician, to also let the collaborator know what is and what isn't feasible. If a collaborator comes to you and wants to design a cluster randomized control trial but only has 2 clusters, obviously that's going to be a problem. So it's very important to inform the investigator at a very early stage what is and what isn't feasible as part of the application, as it might sometimes influence if the application is actually worthwhile to submit or not. When writing your sections for a research proposal, the sections you're typically responsible for is a sample size section and a statistical analysis section, and you will have to deal with the challenge of space. So a space in order to write the information that you want to convey to any reviewer of the grant application. It's important to make sure that you have enough space in order to make sure your sample size can be, for instance, independently checked, and someone who's reading your analysis section can see how your analysis methodology will be able to answer your research question. I would strongly advise you to always read the last version of the grant before it is submitted. Very often, space is a difficult topic, it's challenging, and it might be that the investigator, for very good reasons, might want to remove a word here and there from also your statistical section. But if, for example, they remove the word significance level as a sample size section, then suddenly the information which is available for your reviewer may not be sufficient to reproduce your sample size. So it is important that any word change to your section is a change that still conveys the same message, but doesn't really impact the possibility for the reviewer to assess the quality of your research. Now, another important topic when you are part of a collaborative grant is the position on the grant. And you can be a chief investigator or you can be an associate investigator. I deliberately did not put 1/3 option on this slide, and it is being not named. That should not be the case. You should either be a chief investigator or an associate investigator if you have a substantial part in the grant, which involves you to be part of this application and the future research from the start of the project until the end of the project. But of course, this depends on many factors. There might be funding requirements which might prevent you to actually be an investigator on the trial. That has happened in the past in some of the NHMRC schemes. Or there may be track record requirements. Maybe they need an early researcher, or maybe they need a senior researcher. And then there's the inevitable collaborator preference to maybe have a senior researcher instead of a junior researcher. In that case, it is either your role or the role of your manager to negotiate or discuss with this collaborator what the options are for you to be named as a chief investigator or an associate investigator on the ground. It is possible to have 2 statisticians on a collaborative grant. They can be in the role of chief investigator and associate investigator, or they can even be in the role of 2 chief investigators, as long as the role that they're playing is very distinct from each other and is very clear. So the reviewers have no question about your actual role as part of the collaborative grant application. So assuming you are a chief investigator on the grant, you will have to write a 1 or 2 page document that describes your expertise and your experience that is relevant to this particular grant application. And generally, there are a list of topics that you need to address, and I've bulleted them on this slide, and I will go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. The requirements of what you actually have to write in this 1 or 2 page CV varies from grant to grant, so it is very important to read the grant requirements and also to see and ask your chief investigator what the requirements are of the grant if you cannot find them. It is very important to tailor your 1 or 2 page document to each grant. For example, there are 2 medical fields that I work quite often in. One of the medical fields is anemia, and the other one is the anesthesia interventions. So if I support a grant application for anemia research, I will make sure that I highlight the successful grants that I have in the field of anemia, and will highlight the publications that I have in the field of anemia. And I will do the same if I'm writing a grant that supports an anesthesia trial. So it is important to tailor to the grants. So as a statistician, you're not just responsible for the statistics, you show that you have experience and expertise within that specific medical field. If you're writing it for the first time, please be aware that it takes some time to write this 1 or 2 page document. You might think it's only 1 or 2 pages, but it takes some time to get sure that all of your strengths are well represented in that 1 or 2 pages. It's not that much space after all. So allow for a review by a colleague or a manager, and if you have someone within your institute from a grant office department, then having that independent review is very valuable. If I have the opportunity for someone to review my 1 or 2 pages, I still would provide it to someone else to have it reviewed and allow them to comment and make sure that it's as strong as possible for that particular grant. So if you look at how a 1 or 2 page is typically structured, it typically has the components which are shown on this slide. This is the example of an NHMRC clinical trial and cohort study grant application for last year. So it usually has an overall track record where you provide some background about your experience and expertise and your roles, as well as anything relative to opportunity. You might have some career summary about your qualifications and your positions that you might have held. Some collaborations, national, international, which typically refer to any grants that you hold together with the chief investigator or other investigators on the ground. Any supervision or mentoring that you might have provided as part of master students or PhD students, or whether those students would have gone on to win any awards, for example. Then you also have community engagement and involvement, which is typically a very challenging one for statisticians. But you think about, for example, some media exposure that you might have had. Maybe you've written an article for the conversation. That would be worthwhile to mention in this particular heading. Then the contribution to the field of research is usually related to your publications. You might want to highlight certain publications or the impact of your publications and how they, specifically for this grant, would be valuable to highlight. There is also the topic of international standing, which refers to any presentations you might have provided at international conferences or posters you have presented. Peer review, you can see it here on the screen, will be about any review that you've provided to granting bodies, to manuscript reviews, or an editorial role that you might have. And then there are professional activities where you can typically mention that you're a member of the Statistical Society of Australia. And if you have been part of the conference organization of the upcoming conference, then you would be stating here that you're part of the organization committee of the next meeting of the Statistical Society. There is sometimes also another option, which I have used in the past. As Taya already said, my background is also partly in pharmaceutical industry. So in case I need to strengthen my experience or expertise in clinical trials, I might use that other category to highlight some achievements that I may have had in my time during the pharmaceutical industry. Another important aspect is the budget component. So it is very important to think about whether your role or any other role related to data handling is relevant and needed for the remainder of the project. Usually, of course, in a clinical trial and observation study, that will be the case. There will be a need for a data manager, and there will be a need for a statistician to be involved from start to finish. So it is important to negotiate and to let the investigator know that the budget needs to be included in the grant application. And those costs need to be built in so that later on, if the grant is successful, you or someone else is able to execute the role. Now, if you ask for budget through the NHMRC or MRFF, you usually work through so-called personal support packages. In the personal support packages, they outline different levels of expertise, going from PSP1 with the lowest level of expertise to PSP5 with the highest level of expertise. And of course, you have the corresponding enumeration there on the right-hand side. It has to be noted that the salaries which are quoted here are usually not in line with the salaries of academic institutes, at least for the reason that the on-costs are not included, for example. So there is some, let's say, creativity that you have to exhibit in order to make sure that you have enough budget funded or in your grant application to actually hire a person who will do the work, or for yourself to be employed to do the work. Sometimes budget requests for statistical support will not go to PSP packages, but can be included under other research costs. That is usually the case when you might be involved in just a single part of the application, while if you would be involved from start to finish, as is obviously the case for a clinical trial, that usually goes to a PSP package, where you define the level of expertise someone would need, the FTE that we would need per year, an actual justification of why you would need that particular level of expertise and that particular FTE for each year to conduct the role of as a statistician as part of a collaborative grant. What I usually also do is when I communicate my budget with my collaborator, which means I provide the person with a PSP level, an FTE per year, and the actual breakdown line by line of what the role will be each and every year. I also communicate to the investigator what is not included. And with that, I mean, for example, data management. Data management may or may not be part of your role, but for some statisticians, it is not going to be the main part of the role. Instead, for large projects such as clinical trials, it is advised to actually allow for a data manager to be involved, to take up that role and to execute, build a database and to do the data cleaning while the trial is ongoing. And by communicating to the investigator what is not included, what you avoid is the implicit assumption that some investigators have that data management is part of the role of a statistician, which again may or may not be the case, but it might be worthwhile to explicitly communicate what you will and what you will not do as part of the grant application. A helpful budget resource that I would like to point you towards, especially if you're working in the field of clinical trials, is a document that will be put up on this website. Not long, I think sometime in November. It's a document which has been developed by the Statistics in Trials Interest Group, which is part of the Australian Clinical Trial Alliance, and they have developed a document where they advise on the different PSP levels, the FTE levels, as well as template text, how to formulate a justification for budgeting for statistical support as part of a clinical trial or as part of your own investigator trial as a statistician, clinical trial statistician. Then finally, I think this is probably the most important slide, it's time. You need time to be able to work on the application, and you need time to be able to think about the application. And for that, it's important that collaborators approach a statistician well in advance. The collaborators, some collaborators that I work with, I've been collaborating with them for many, many years. When they have a grant application due, they will come to me months in advance and start working through the proposal throughout those months leading up to the submission date. We also have collaborators that come to us 2 weeks in advance of a deadline. Obviously, the type of statistical support you can offer to someone who comes 2 weeks in advance and whom we have never worked with is very different compared to someone we've worked with for many, many years and who's coming to you months in advance. The statistical quality that, or the statistical type of support that you can offer will very much depend on it. And if they come too late, maybe you don't have any opportunity left anymore to actually support them. And you might have to decline support to that particular new collaborator or collaborator that comes in very late. So it takes time to develop your statistical input and to discuss the actual proposal in order to make sure that what you're contributing to the grant is the best that you can do. So it takes time, and the time that we usually allocate to working on collaborative grants can be up to 20 hours for an NHMRC or an MRFF grant, and there are exceptions on either way. You have exceptions where it's a resubmission of an existing grant. In that case, you probably don't have to spend 20 hours. You probably just have to make sure that your stats section is still in order with the updated grant. All of your documentation is already prepared, so you probably need less than 20 hours. But then there are also those grants that need much more time than 20 hours. You have grants that develop very complex trials, such as adaptive trials or platform trials. They will need many, many more hours than 20 hours in order to support a grant application. So time is a very important and helpful thing to have when you're working in the collaborative space. So in summary, I feel that contributing to collaborative grants is actually very rewarding as a collaborative statistician. And obviously, I wouldn't be working in this space if I wouldn't think it is an important role at the design stage of a research proposal to provide statistical input. I think it is important to discuss the research proposal with your collaborator, to negotiate or request any budget, and also to make sure you negotiate your position on the grant. And I can't stress enough how valuable it is to have time to allow yourself think about the topic, but also time that your investigator should allow you to come to you in time and to develop the grant application together with you. So I'd like to thank all of my colleagues who work collaboratively on grants, both statisticians, health economists, co-design implementation scientists, and so on. And finally, I would like to thank you as the audience for listening to this presentation, and I really look forward to discussion afterwards. So I'll hand over now to Virgo, who will present to you about grant development of investigator-initiated trials.
Thank you. Hi everyone, and thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak today. And again, I'd like to start by acknowledging I live and work here on Ghana country, and to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. So, putting together, a little bit to talk about today, I figured I'd kind of start with a little bit about me, and kind of a bit about my journey, on fellowship grants, and then kind of move into trying to give some little overview of the scheme, and then some advice or kind of things I've learned over time. So as you might guess from my accent, from Ireland, so I did my undergraduate and postgraduate training there, which very much pushed me into the field of bioinformatics, systems biology, data analysis. I relocated to Adelaide in mid-2018, and my research very much focuses on high-dimensional data analysis in the context of host-microbe interactions, usually infectious disease or gut microbiome, that sort of thing. For fellowships, I've had 3 applications here. So I'm putting up my unsuccessful ones, which, because I'll come to later, the unsuccessful applications are something that you actually really learn from. And it's important that you kind of have failures because they're going to have to lead to your success. Unsuccessful the first time for my NHMRC Investigator grant, unsuccessful at ARC grant, and then successful finally in the EL1 in 2022. I've also reviewed for the EL scheme twice as well for that's EL Emerging Leader 1 and 2 in 2022 and 2023. And when I talk about these schemes, so it's quite different to the types of project grants or collaborative grants that we just heard about. The Investigator grant in particular, which is what I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about today, is a 5-year fellowship scheme that provides salary and direct research support to a single individual. So there isn't a team applying for this grant, there is one CI. And so as a result, it's, it's a leadership grant essentially. So I have a point here at the bottom that you'll probably feel uncomfortable at the amount of self-promotion you have to do in this grant. And that's something that I've heard from a lot of people, and I felt myself when I was writing this. I had one colleague say that they literally went and talked to their team, and kind of said, well, I know we work in a very collaborative environment, but as I write this grant, it is all about me. And unfortunately, that's kind of what you have to do with these schemes. It doesn't quite reflect reality, but it's a bit of the game we have to play. They're quite competitive. Success rate is on average 15%, but it's that's maybe a bit misleading. It's lower than this at the kind of emerging leader levels. Emerging leaders being sort of 0 to 10 years post PhD, and then it gets higher at the leadership levels, with the highest rate, I believe, at the highest leadership level, which also gets the fewest applicants because this is just extremely experienced professors essentially, or it's what's going to be applying at that level. Unlike a project grant, most of the scoring on this goes to your track record. So I say so 70% is based on track record. 30% of that alone is just top 10 publications. And the Investigator grant is extremely strict, like limits on characters and words throughout. So for those top 10 publications, for example, that is, you get a little box to paste in the citation for that publication, and then you get a box to write maybe 3 sentences or 4 sentences on why this is a good publication. And you do that 10 times, and that is 30% of the entire mark for your Investigator grant. The next section is research impact, which there's 3 sections there where you kind of take what's referred to as a research program, a kind of a set of your publications or maybe all of your publications, and you basically try to craft a narrative around why that's been impactful, how that knowledge has been used, and so on. And then you have a few sections after that for leadership, which again is where you outline stuff like supervision, mentoring, your role in professional societies, organizing meetings, peer review, all of those sorts of activities. You don't actually submit a CV. And the other thing is, because these sections are all just boxes that you paste in on the online system, there's also no formatting in these either. So it's very bare bones, short amount of text that goes into these, which is something to keep in mind. The remaining of the application then is a research proposal. 5 pages for what's called a program of work, i.e. not a specific project. And unlike the grants that we just heard about, this is typically actually a lot lighter on detail. You might think that makes it sound easier, but I think it's actually a bit harder. There's no budget that's required for this, and it's far more focused around solving a big problem or a set of problems kind of under one umbrella. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a silly amount of self-promotion you have to do when writing these grants. I led this, I innovated this, I came up with this solution. In reality, of course, we all work in collaborative environments, so it's not entirely true, but that is the nature of those schemes. I also have a little bit of experience with the ARC DECRA. This is the ARC's early career fellowship, which is 3 years. It provides similar level of salary and research support to the Investigator. I believe you can only apply twice, but maybe double check that with your research office. So you do need to be a bit strategic on that. The program is specific for ECRs at the mid-career level. There's then that moves into their future fellowship scheme. Success rate is similar, and the ARC DECRA, it's a far longer application than the Investigator app. It's a lot more detailed. You need an itemized budget and so on. But actually, because of that, I found it a bit easier to write, actually, because you're not so limited in what you can put on the page. And Also to note, the ARC system, the review system is quite different. In the investigator grants, you'll put in your application and you'll get back scores and comments at the end with a funded yes or no. With ARC, your application will first go to expert reviewers. You'll then get their comments and you'll write a reply to those, and then those together go to the College of Experts who make the final decision on funding. I'm not sure if it's better or worse system, but it is what it is. So a bit more on my fellowship application story. So I moved here in 2018. I had pretty strong metrics for an ECR. I was quite lucky during my kind of earlier on in my career to have been given a number of opportunities that led to me having a few well-cited papers. So some senior researchers here in my institute in Adelaide had indicated that I should probably consider one of these fellowship schemes. And like I said, I just moved from Ireland and I really had absolutely no idea what the funding landscape looked like. But when I looked at what the average metrics were for a successful EL1, I very much on paper looked like a successful applicant. So I thought, okay, let's go for it. I spent months working on the first investigator application, sent it off, thought I had a pretty good shot, and I scored a 4.7, which I'll tell you now is not a great score. Funding cut off was 5.5. And I was disappointed by this, and I found it difficult to reconcile why there was that disconnect between, the quote unquote metrics being good, but my score being so far off. So with some discussions with kind of mentors here, we then decided to try for the DECRA scheme with me. Similarly, spent months on that with research office. The university here was good enough to hire some external writers that helped refine that, but again was unsuccessful. But I think my score would have been pushed up. The ARC doesn't give you the scoring in the same way, but I did find out I was in the top 10% of unsuccessful applicants, so it seemed that it was at least close. And at this point, I had a bit of a decision to make. I was kind of at that 5 years post PhD, which, although it's not a strict cutoff for the EL1 category, it's hard when you go beyond that to be in the EL1. So actually, against the advice of colleagues, I decided to take one more crack at the investigator grant, rewrote it from the ground up, and got it this time. So I'm outlining that there because, as has been mentioned about time, I mean, this was a 2-year process for me. And frankly, maybe you'll be the one that will get it first time, but, I needed those multiple rounds to refine it down to an application that would be successful. And, I've had colleagues had a similar experience that they needed those multiple applications to do that. When I looked back at my first investigator grant application recently for this talk, I was a bit appalled by that. I was like, this is terrible. Like, I would not fund this now. But that also kind of helped because I was pretty bad when I started, but I did manage to get there. And so just to reiterate that this is a learnable skill. It's not some inherent thing that people have or don't have. It's something that can be learned. I'm now just going to kind of talk through some general advice from kind of my experience. The first thing is just to be honest and to kind of identify and ask the question, is the fellowship scheme the right one for you? So sometimes it's not, and that's fine. My track record is equal parts hard work and luck, but not everyone gets the same opportunities. For example, I would never have been competitive as a lead CI on an ideas grant, period. I just wouldn't have been. I have colleagues that maybe they wouldn't have been competitive on a investigator grant, but they are on ideas. So to think about those schemes and think about the pros and cons and think about what you'll be strongest for. Use your research office for this and talk to them. Something to consider with the investigator grant scheme, you're blocked off from being a CI on ideas grants if you're successful. So do think about that because, although the amount of, if you're an early career researcher, you think, well, 50,000 a year, that's so much money. It is not. You will need other grants. So you really do need to be strategic on this, on ways to get that other funding. Start years in advance. Assume you'll need to apply multiple times. Maybe you won't need to, but if you try to factor in those time, which admittedly isn't possible for everyone, but do think about that. Look at the leadership guidelines now in particular for the investigator grant. You can just get the guidelines for these online, and that's the only thing the reviewers have. That's what the reviewers work from. So if you're working from that same document, you should really try to align that there. In my experience, I think people are probably most likely to be competitive as they're on the border of becoming ineligible for that scheme, at least at the early career level. So by that time, you want your application to be pretty polished because it's going to be your last go with it, right? So do think about that, and plan that time where possible. Um, this next point is something that on my first time reviewing for the Investigator grant scheme, we had this Zoom call with a bunch of reviewers, and we heard from some experienced reviewers who talked on it. And the first one, they said the number one quality of a successful application is that it must be clear. And then they said number two, it must be exciting. And number three was everything else. And as I sort of then started reviewing myself, I realized just how true this is. You can sometimes get reviewers from different fields. Sometimes I end up reviewing a grant for a field I'm not really an expert in. If I don't understand it, frankly, the content is irrelevant because I just won't be able to actually make a decision on it. So think about this and think about making sure that your grant is accessible to people from different backgrounds. On that, thinking about how it's going to be reviewed, and this is where experience reviewing or talking to colleagues that have reviewed will be important. A key goal when writing this is making it easy for the reviewers to extract the key pieces of information. Don't assume a reviewer will sit down and read your application from start to finish. In fact, we were instructed specifically not to do that for the Investigator grant applications. We were told, start with the proposals, do those for all the candidates, finish them, score them, because you don't want the track record to bias your interpretation of someone's proposal. Then after you've done that, then you do the publications for everyone, and then you do the other parts of the track record for everyone. So because of that, you can end up with someone who maybe assume that, oh, well, I've read their publications, so I know how feasible their proposal is, but actually I don't. And so perhaps their proposal end up getting scored lowly for feasibility because I really don't know what their track record is. So think about that, and you kind of need to make every section stand by itself without it kind of being repetitive, which is it's a fine line to walk, but it's possible, it's doable. Think about your reviewer's expertise. So we often get things that are different fields to us. So, I've been a co-author on various neuroscience papers where I've done some bioinformatics or biostats for them, similarly on long COVID. And so I might be asked to review a long COVID application that's full of neuroscience details. If I can't understand those, again, I'm not going to be scoring that well. So just making sure to think about that and making sure that that application is going to be accessible to as broad an audience as possible. A way I found to get around this is I try to have one little section where I jam in a bunch of methods detail, and then throughout, you'll sort of scatter in your own citations to be like, well, and I will do this using my established techniques. How do you know I've established techniques? Here I'm citing my papers where I've done that. And that allows you to kind of sidestep some of that methods, detail, and jargon while still assuring the reviewers that you can do this. Field-weighted citation index is the key metric that we often look at as reviewers. So this is the ratio of citations to the expected of expected number of citations to the real citations. So field-weighted citation index of 1 means it's cited basically an average amount. If it's 5, it means it's cited 5x more. NHMRC really likes this because different fields will be cited more or less. So by having this ratio, essentially, it allows you to kind of normalize for that effect. To be competitive for the Investigator grant, you will need at a minimum 5 to 10 papers with a field weighted above 1, and ideally a few that are above 5.2. Typically, when I'm reviewing this, someone will usually have at least one paper that has a field weighted citation of kind of 10 to maybe 50 or 100, insanely well cited papers. You can get these from Scopus. I think I've mentioned this already, and I'll keep coming back to it. Write to the guidelines. Get the guidelines. It's like a 70-page document or something you can just get online off the NHMRC website. Everything you put down should be addressing a specific criteria. For example, if the guidelines mention international impact, you look at who has cited your work from other countries and give specific examples of that. Use the language from the guidelines. Do the reviewer's job for them. Make it as simple and clear as possible. We often have maybe somewhere between 15 and 25 of these to review, and we're not really being paid for this. We don't have a lot of time to put into it. So by doing that, you can really help, I think, bump up your scores. Start reviewing grants, talk to your research office, get set up on Sapphire. The reviewing is time consuming, but oh my God, you learn so much. It's really, really it completely changed my perspective on writing grants when I started reviewing them. I mentioned this already, but if you're planning to apply in a couple of years, look at the leadership guidelines now. You can't just get more papers or more citations easily, but you can volunteer to be a convener of meeting. You can volunteer to do more organizing, that sort of thing. And that can allow you to bump up all of those things as well. And this is something that Sabine mentioned a bit as well, that tailoring how you present yourself to your application. We all wear a lot of hats. We all work across different disciplines. So initially, I always presented myself as a bioinformatician, and that was very much my identity. But that label, I think, is actually seen by some as research support role, rather than the person that's driving the research. And I think the same is true of statisticians. So to think about what that role is that you're playing in the grant and putting your best foot forward. So, for example, if I'm the lead CI in a grant, I'm not going to be playing up my technical expertise. Whereas if I'm maybe CID or an AI, then it's going to be all technical expertise all the time. You know, if someone spent 10 years analyzing, you know, big public health data sets on lung cancer, you might think of yourself as a data analysis expert, but you've probably been publishing those in cancer journals. And really, you're also an expert in cancer. And so if you're writing for a health and medical grant, you'll probably want to lead with that and lead with that impact on the disease first, while maybe having some of those other details about the data analysis and the tools that you use to solve that health problem, they can come secondary. That's a little bit of trial and error I found in my experience to figure out that story, but doing so it's very, very useful, I think. And then just wrapping up on this and then move on to some questions is really what kind of helped me survive grant season was a realization that it's not about me or it's not about you. It's about the reviewers and it's about the guidelines. The system we have is underfunded and frequently very unfair, but we just have to figure out how to kind of work in and frankly, you know, manipulate that system to be successful. It's easier said than done. You know, sometimes this is make or break for a project or even your job security is on the line. So, you know, it's all very, you know, it's easy for me to sit here and give advice, obviously, when I'm not in a difficult situation, but to kind of take yourself out of it and really try and come at it from as objective a point of view as possible, I think is really the key to being successful. And yes, guidelines, guidelines, guidelines. And with that, I'll finish up and go to questions.
Thanks very much to both of you. What a couple of absolutely ripping slide decks. I really wish someone had presented me these talks about 3 years ago. So many practical tips there for everyone on the line. So thank you again for clearly putting quite a bit of thought into those slides. I'm sure we have an absolute avalanche of questions coming in on the chat. Maybe I'll exercise the chair's prerogative while we wait for one. One for Sabine, I think. You mentioned that sometimes you decide very diplomatically put that you're not able to support a grant. Those discussions can be very difficult. And I'm wondering how, you know, do you have any practical tips for negotiating those moments where you're invited onto a collaborative project? How do you decide in a timely manner whether you think it's going to work? And then how do you communicate that decision in a way that doesn't blow up in your face?
Yes, that is a very challenging topic. And unfortunately, there's no real black and white answer to that either. So obviously, when they come to you like a week before a deadline, sometimes practically it isn't feasible at all to provide all of the input that you need, just because it takes a certain amount of time to write sections and to compile everything. So that is usually the more easier one to say no to. Then you have the ones that come to you when there's still time to compile, but you notice that in terms of availability, it's just very challenging to manage that work by you or your team. But also sometimes the positions that you already have promised are already taken. So it's maybe you don't have any positions anymore available support to provide a grant. So that might also be an argument to kindly say no to that request and say that unfortunately positions have already been taken, or our staff is already at capacity of supporting grants. But having said that, of course, there will be the inevitable exception to the rule that you still support, irrespective of whether they come in. So it's a challenging topic to negotiate, and you have to make sure that you take into account the collaborator where he or she is coming from, because obviously they want to have best opportunity possible to get their grant funded. And that's why they might come to you as a collaborator. And on the other hand, you as a statistician, you want to make sure that you are able to provide the support that they need. And if you notice that they come to you with a very challenging grant application, which require for you to have no capacity or no time, I think it's worthwhile to communicate it as soon as possible rather than to provide under work that is not up to scratch, and which eventually also impacts their chances of getting funded by having a lower rate score for their grant application. Yeah.
Thanks very much. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. One for Fergal from Katie Harris. Any advice on the impact section? Perhaps how did that evolve for you between your apps, and any tips for that section?
Sure. So the just for context, the impact section is part of track record, and it's broken into 3 parts. It sounds really weird when you actually read it, but it's part 1 is the research. What is it? It's the impact and significance of the research program. Part 2 is the program's contribution to the impact, and part 3 is your contribution to the impact. So it can be a little confusing to write those. Some tips for writing those sections, though, is again, it's go to the guidelines. It's on like page 45 or 50 or something like that. It gives a bunch of definitions of things related to this. So a very common mistake I see people make is they don't clearly define a research program. What is this research program about? Where was it conducted? So I would just say, in my case, that was about work in inflammatory bowel disease that I did in Ireland. So step 1, this research program was my body of work related to inflammatory bowel disease. It had X papers, which together had Y citations, and then talked a little bit about what that program found. Throughout the course of that program, we developed some algorithms and some sort of novel methodologies. So this allowed for, again, this is one of the things that's in the guidelines, talking about the impact of your research program, but also impact beyond the field. So if you develop a methodology that can be applied elsewhere, that's, impact within the disease, and then impact beyond that field as well. And so linking those things together. Something else to think about is that when you give that research program, it's actually not all about you. This is an interesting part. You can put everything you did in the 3rd part, and you can show how important you were. But in that first part, you can have papers that maybe you were sort of tangentially involved in, maybe you're not even a co-author on, but the program produced those. This is more probably at the EL level. Once you're at the leadership level, you kind of need to be, really on top of it. But at the EL level, you can kind of talk about a much larger research program, and as long as you had a really critical role in that, that's okay. But yes, clearly define a research program. Don't just try and fit in your whole track record, or if you do, don't frame it that way.
Thank you. And one for Sabine. So when you're helping 20 grants and only one of those might get supported in a call, any insight into how to support one's own position with those PSP allocations being, as you mentioned, quite underbaked?
Yes, yeah, that is a challenging part. The thing that I didn't mention in the presentation is that the group that I'm part of provide grant support for free up to 20 hours because we have some core funding. So that allows those grants to be supported for free. Well, in return, we expect that we are part of the grant application with future funding. And so if the grant is successful, they will automatically have to come back to us in order to then execute the actual grant. And as that, we also incorporate it as part of the actual funding for the grants. I can understand that there may be settings where people are not in a situation where they have some core funding. And then if you have 20 grants and each of them is supported up to 20 hours, that is probably not a very sustainable model. But yeah, I think that is, in terms of PSP allocation, what we generally do is we take into account the fact that we have provided some support, and in that sense, we inflate some of the PSP allocations slightly in order to compensate for the time that we're going to spend, but maybe also the time that we might have spent. If grant applications take really a lot of time, sometimes you think about some of the more complicated trials, you may want to decide to charge ahead, but obviously not every investigator has funding available to actually provide those funds, especially in their early career. So that might be not an option for many collaborators. Yeah.
Thanks, Sabine. And I think let's just quickly squeeze in an answer to this last question for Fergal. So when you made the switch from EL1 to DECRA, did you pitch the same idea, or obviously with modifications for the DECRA? But can you just let us know how that worked?
Yeah, it was, I guess, this kind of same problem, but the DECRA version was changed quite a lot. It was much more focused on us understanding the fundamental biology of a system, rather than the NHMRC version, which is about solving a particular health problem. And in order to solve the problem, we have to understand the system. So yeah, no, it was definitely reworked. And look, I've actually reviewed investigator grants that, I sit down to read it and I'm like, this is very clearly a DECRA that's just been copied and pasted over. So yeah, I don't think they're, you do need to change a lot, I think, between them. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're right up to the hour. I think we might leave it there. This talk was recorded, so if you didn't write down those practical winning tips, you can hopefully revisit this talk. I'd like to thank our presenters for what's been a really sensational lunchtime session. I think we need more chat about grants in the section in 2024. Thank you very much for your attendance, and wishing you all a stress-free wrap up to grant writing this year, and all the best for the applications you have under consideration.